Be here. Anytime I have a chance to talk about the importance of women in politics, I grab it. So thank you for listening. Women have made an enormous, can you hear me now? That's better, yes, okay, I can tell. It's an opportunity to share what has been an exciting adventure for many of us who have worked to try and establish an environment where more and more women could find themselves in the pipeline and end up in public service. My particular investment was Patricia Schroeder. Don't know if I know you've heard of her. She was a senator in Colorado, and that was my first, I was in graduate school for her first election, and that was my introduction to the world of politics and women. And frankly, I had very little notion of what that meant. I just liked her, and I loved her ideas, but the notion of women, you know, was relatively early in the 70s, and I just really didn't think about it. It wasn't until I got to know her and listened to the way she talked about how different women's agendas are from men's agendas. And the fact that women, if allowed to or found themselves in public life, would in fact not only come with a different set of politics that they wanted to put in place, a different agenda, but they would also do business differently. And that's an interesting question. Now we know that there are a number of women in politics, made their way up. It's far from an equal thing, but nonetheless, they have made quite an inroad. And we can answer the question, it's no longer theoretical, it's empirical. Do women make a difference? And the answer is yes. Yes, we do. We make a difference both in our agenda, what we think is important in political life, and also in the way we do business. It was very clear that women cross the aisle more often to work with colleagues from the other party than Republican women do, frankly, or Republican men. So women come with a different agenda, and they also do politics differently. They are more willing to work in groups. They are more willing to find answers to things aside from toe-to-toe, arguments and gripping. How do we know this? One of the things I would recommend to you is the Center for American Women in Politics, which is part of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. They have done wonderful research looking at whether there is such a thing as a gender gap. Of course there is, but much less than it used to be. Who are the women in politics? Where do they come from? How do they get into the game? Women's History Month, which is the month we're in March, is very interesting. It was designated by Congress in 1987 to be a month set aside to study the effect of women in history in the United States, because there was very little known about this. What have been their accomplishments? There was very little in history books. I don't know, certainly in my generation, very little in history books about the accomplishments of women. Hello. And very little really up until the present time. And the reason that there is more and more, that there are scholastic books for children about the achievements of women, U.S. women, American women in politics, women of color, and newcomer immigrant women, is because of the work of the National Women's History Project. And it's interesting for us because this is centered in Sonoma, California. They were the ones at Sonoma State University in the early 80s who were determined to put women's history back on the national agenda in education. So they started in Sonoma and then began to work out from that. And in 1987, the U.S. Congress dedicated the month of March to be a month set aside for the study of the achievements of women in U.S. history. This wasn't easy. It started in the late 70s in Sonoma with the notion that they would get a day. There was a Women's Day, which was March 7th. Why March, you might ask? Why is it May, Women's History Month? It's March because the first women's union, if you will, was put into place in March in 1857 in the city of New York. Garment workers who were struggling very much and very hard in order to have just, better wages and a better working situation. were finally allowed to unionize, or partially unionize, to organize. So March was always a resident month. So when the Women's History Project in Sonoma decided to tackle this notion of women's history, they chose the month of March. It's also interesting, I think, symbolically, because it follows Black History Month, and because Black history and women's history have met together in so many important ways, both historically and ideologically. Okay? The women's movement, after all, emerged from the anti-slavery movement in the 1830s. The earliest leaders of the suffragist movement for vote were the women who were the anti-slavery leaders. These were largely Quaker women. Why? Because Quakers were the only women, as you know, allowed to speak out in public in the 19th century. So they formed a natural leadership cadre. When women who were opposed to slavery formed their own anti-slavery groups in New York and on the East Coast, they were invited to attend the International Anti-Slavery Convention in London in the year 1840, the month of June. 3,000 miles from home, these women went, 18 of them. Imagine, they left their families. Many of them had never ventured far from their homes at all. Queen Victoria, a woman, is a queen in London. They get there and their credentials will not be accepted by the conference. They refuse to seat the women. There was argument back and forth, which is a very interesting discussion in itself. But what it ended up doing was having the women sitting up in the gallery behind a curtain and behind a bar by themselves. The only gentleman who joined them was William Lloyd Garrison, who was quite a liberal leader at the time, both of the slavery movement as well as the women's movement. So there they were sitting up there, thinking how unfair this was, and they began, taking strolls around the outside, getting to know each other very well, and said, how different is this? How different is our exclusion from what we've been working on, the anti-slavery issue? How different is this? So it turned out to be a very good thing because they got to know each other very well, formed fast friendships. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there in between pregnancies, and they decided, let's meet again. We'll meet up in New York at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home because she'll probably be pregnant. So they decided, they did, she was most of the time. So there it was, she had a number of children. So she and Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Mott and many others met at the Seneca Falls for their first meeting in 1848. Very, very interesting. There were almost 300 people there. Only 62 ended up signing the convention's constitution, which was based upon the U.S. Constitution, or rather Declaration of Independence. And this was called the Declaration of Sentiments. And it simply went through the Declaration of Independence, and where it said men, they added women. So, it was too radical at the time, and very few of the people there would actually sign it. But that became, I think, the beginning of the women's movement for suffrage. It had been bubbling in different places, different parts of the country, but this was the firmest organizational response to this. Civil War comes along, the women are told, this is a decade after the Seneca Falls Conference, they're told, put your grievances away because, we have something much more important before us. We have, the Union dissolving under our very feet, and we can't afford to look at your issue right now. So, ladies, if you would go home and, come back after the war is over, we'll help you out then. So they did. And they were quiescent during this period in the national interest. When the war was won, they went back to Congress and said, okay, here we are. And Congress said, well, we have other things we have to take care of. And those I can understand. I think we all could. We have to give the black man the vote. So the 14th Amendment passed and gave, for the first time, the word male into the U.S. Constitution. So women were not only being helped by being quiescent and cooperating during the Civil War, they were further behind, because now they couldn't possibly take this issue state by state. It had to be another federal constitutional amendment in order to change the language, because the 14th Amendment stated that the vote would be given to black males. Bless their hearts, but that left everybody else out. And so consequently they went back, began to work decade after decade after decade, and then finally, as you know, 1920, the 19th Amendment gives women the vote. Hooray. Were there great changes? Were there great changes as a result of this? No. It was one of the biggest disappointments, I think, to women leaders, because the majority of women stayed home. They didn't vote. They didn't get engaged in politics. If they did vote, they tended to vote the way their husbands did. So the voice of women was not heard. The 1940s come along and the war, and women are taken out of their little worlds and begin to work in the workplace. And you know, they found they liked it. A lot of them realized they liked it. They liked having their own money, they liked getting out of the house, they liked doing something useful. So when the war was over and they were asked to go back home again, they declined and remained in the workplace and began to look at the workplace rather critically. So the beginning, the origin, I would say, of the second wave of feminism begins after World War II, when women like Betty Friedan and others in the 50s are beginning to question, what is it that's going on here in terms of women's relative powerlessness in the workplace? By the Kennedy administration in 1961, there had been a definite change. Kennedy was very interested in placing women in politics, and he did. The National Commission for the Advancement of Women and others began to reach out, and to our credit, the Democratic Party was the party that helped women into politics more than anything else. Republicans were not paying any attention, and the Democrats really did reach down, open up the doors, and bring women in. But just as abolition was the, if you want, the motivation for the suffragist movement, the civil rights movement of the late 50s and early 60s is what engendered an interest in women to become politically more involved. So that we can see that historically the connection between the black rights movements and the women's movements were very close. This is a very, very broad topic. We could do a lot with it, and I'd be glad to talk with you further, but this is a little tiny, tiny bird's eye introduction. I have a film that I'd like to show you. It's about 20 minutes. It's a good overview. And then we're going to have a little sing-along.